Before commencing this workshop, I would just like to introduce myself. My name is Father Robert Cross. I am a priest of the Diocese of Geraldton. I've been ordained for 38 years and I am currently working in the area of caring and valorising or realising the potential of the diocese's significant heritage holdings, particularly as they refer to the priest architect Monsignor John Cyril Hawes, 1876 to 1956. In 2007 and 8, I was privileged to enrol in a course at the Gregorian University that was established by that university to assist the Church in the care and protection of its heritage and to realise its potential as a means to evangelise. It is from this course and the paper that I wrote as part of that course that much of my material will come for this talk today. I would also just simply like to say that I would have dearly loved to be present at this liturgy meeting or biennial liturgy meeting, but regretfully in the last couple of weeks I have had a bit of a health scare and ongoing medical investigations have prevented me from travelling. I have a particular interest in this area because I think for a long time now we've had something of a cultural cringe in Australia, and this has also filtered into the mind of many in the Church, where many people would say that here in Australia we don't have any cultural heritage. And I think this myth needs to be exploded and busted, and that we need to, first of all, get a grasp around the fact that we do have significant cultural heritage in this country, and it is an extension, or needs to be understood as an extension of that great missionary thrust of the 18th and 19th century European Church to the ends of the earth. And the Diocese of Geraldton, of course, is very much at the ends of the earth, and that this is or shows that spread of the gospel, this missionary evangelizing mission of the Church to reach out to all peoples in all parts of the world. This workshop is presented today by the National Liturgical Architecture and Art Board, the NLAAB. The mandate of the NLAAB calls for it to advise the Bishop's Commission for Liturgy in 3 areas, namely liturgical architecture, the liturgical arts, and thirdly, liturgical cultural patrimony. This workshop will focus on the third of those 3 areas, that is liturgical cultural patrimony. Before getting into the substance of this workshop, I want to say that I will use interchangeably the term patrimony or cultural patrimony with the term heritage or cultural heritage. In its English documents, the Church tends to use the term patrimony rather than heritage. The Code of Canon Law uses the term goods or cultural goods when talking about items of cultural heritage. This is a direct translation of the Latin original of the Code. It is interesting to note that in the Italian Church, and the Italian state for that matter, they've picked up on the Latin and used the term beni culturali, which translates in English to cultural goods when speaking about cultural heritage. The department responsible for cultural heritage in the main at the Vatican level or at the curial level is the Pontifical Council for Culture, and this council works together with the Congregation for Divine Worship and Discipline of Sacraments in regards to culture as it relates to music, art and sacred architecture, and also liturgy in that regard, and the Congregation for the Clergy and the Congregation for Catholic Education in regard to academic formation of priests and laity. The Church, in defining cultural patrimony, approaches it from both a secular and religious perspective. In a secular sense, the Church defines cultural patrimony as the material witness of civilization in the weave or fabric of the environment within which humanity lives and which humanity shapes day after day in the evolutionary changes of time. The understanding that humanity and cultural patrimony are seen within the broader context of the environment, or the weave or fabric of the environment as in this definition, is broadly accepted both by the Church and international community in this day and age. And this can be seen in international treaties, which in turn have shaped national legislation around cultural heritage. For example, in Australia at a federal level, our cultural heritage legislation is to be found in the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act 1999, and this act is administered by a department called the Department of Environment and Energy. So both in the title of the Act and the title of the department, there is no mention whatsoever of cultural heritage, nor for that matter, natural heritage. Both cultural heritage and natural heritage are seen within the one context of the environment, and that cultural heritage and natural heritage receive their significance through aesthetic, historic, scientific, social, spiritual, and/or life support values. In defining cultural patrimony in a religious, or perhaps more correctly, ecclesiastical context, the Church understands cultural patrimony to specifically referring to those things which the Church has produced, received, conserved, and continues to use for worship, evangelization, and the diffusion of culture. They are a testament and document of the faith of a people. They are also works of art, monuments of history, and manifestations of culture and civilization. The more astute among you may have noticed that the definitions just given refer mostly to material culture, but cultural heritage, cultural patrimony refers much more than just to the tangible. It also refers to intangible cultural heritage, to things like music and liturgy, to ritual, and other practices that happen within our churches. So heritage needs to be understood both in terms of tangible and intangible, and also immovable and movable heritage. So when it comes to our tangible heritage, it's important that we just don't focus alone on the building, but also all that furnishes the building and all those items and elements within the building that are used within the context of religious or liturgical practices. So our buildings or our tangible heritage need to be understood in terms, as well as the building itself, of furnishings, liturgical items, and many other elements. And one of those elements that is often overlooked, and as an archaeologist I'd like to point to, is the archaeological record that can be found in these places. And the archaeological record, from my experience at least, is important because it tells not only the story of the rich and powerful, of the bishops and priests and the committees that might have built a building, but it tells the story also of those simple folk who built these edifices and of those who come to these edifices to worship and pray, to be educated and so on. So I'd strongly urge that when it comes to refurbishing, conserving, restoring our heritage buildings, there should always be included some element of an archaeological investigation so that a fuller history, a fuller story is found within these places for the good of the church and the good of the community. For the church, cultural patrimony essentially promotes an authentic humanism modelled on Christ as the new Adam. This idea is spelt out in the document Gaudium et Spes, number 22. For the Church, cultural patrimony has three basic ends which have a common theme in themselves of service. Firstly, and above all, it is at the service of the mission of the Church, that mission being evangelization. Secondly, cultural patrimony is at the service of the wider community and culture and ecclesiastical history. And thirdly, cultural patrimony serves to communicate both artistic and ecclesial values. I would now like to turn to canon law and what it requires of us in the care of the Church's cultural patrimony. The first area that I would like to look at is the need for inventories. Canon law very clearly states in Canon 1283 Article 2 that before ecclesiastical administrators begin their function, be they priest, religious or lay, they are to draw up a clear and accurate inventory to be signed by themselves of all immovable goods, of those movable goods which are precious or in any way of cultural value, and any other goods with a description and an estimate of their value, and they are to review any inventory already drawn up. Regretfully, this canon law, as is the case in my experience of much of canon law, is more honoured in the breach than in the observance, as Shakespeare is wont to say. Further to this, canon law spells out for us what preciousness of goods means. Canon 1292 states that the preciousness of goods arise not only from their material value, but also from coming to the church by virtue of a vow, or, and importantly for our case here, because it has artistic, historical, or cultural value. Most of us will recall a few years ago where a very well-intentioned Spanish lady took it upon herself to restore a 19th century fresco in her local church, regretfully with the most disastrous of outcomes, but quite amusing for many. Canon 1189 states that if they are in need of repair, precious images, that is, those distinguished by age, art or veneration, which are exhibited in churches or oratories for the reverence of the faithful, are never to be restored without the written permission of the ordinary, and the ordinary is to consult experts before he grants permission. Again, I say that my experience, and I think the experience of all of us here, is that this is more honoured in the breach than in the observance. Canon 1190 forbids the selling of sacred relics, and it goes on to say that significant relics or sacred images honoured with great veneration cannot be alienated or perpetually transferred without the permission of the Holy See. This canon is further reinforced with Canon 1292, Article 2, which says bishops must seek the permission of the Holy See before they alienate objects which are precious by reason of their artistic or historical significance, whatever their economic value. And when a bishop is uncertain about the preciousness of an object in terms of their artistic or historical significance, a bishop is obliged to seek the advice of experts for such determinations. I would now like to turn to ecclesiastical cultural heritage and how civil law applies in its regard. I guess it needs to be stated first and foremost that ecclesiastical cultural heritage, which is listed by the state, has applied to it state laws, except in the case, in some states at least, not all, in regard to necessary liturgical changes. But such changes are required to be signed off by a competent ecclesiastical authority, someone with expertise, stating that this is a necessary change. Anyhow, state governments have the primary responsibility to identify and to conserve cultural heritage in Australia, and where church buildings or heritage is listed on their registers, this applies in those cases. In this regard, state and indeed local government will impose themselves on all development applications of heritage listed church properties. The document which underpins Australia's heritage laws and the work of heritage professionals in Australia is called the Borough Charter, which was revised in 2013. And it's important for anybody involved in cultural heritage management in the church to be across this document. As I said, it is the guiding document both for state heritage laws and for heritage professionals. Briefly then, the Borough Charter is the Australian Charter for Places of Cultural Significance and is founded on the International Charter for the Conservation and Restoration of Monuments and Sites that was drawn up in Venice in 1966, and the resolutions of the Fifth General Assembly of the International Council of Monuments and Sites, ICOMOS, in Moscow in 1978. The Borough Charter was formulated in 1979, with subsequent revisions being made, and the latest being in 2013. It derives the name Borough from a town in South Australia called Burra, where the Australian ICMOS first met to formulate the Charter in 1979. In conclusion, I would like to return to the concept of authentic humanism. In 2008, in an address to the Plenary Assembly of the Pontifical Council for Culture, Pope Benedict XVI said, "The death of God, proclaimed by so many intellectuals in recent decades, is giving way to a barren cult of the individual. In this cultural context, there is a risk of drifting into spiritual atrophy and emptiness of heart." This image of the Scream, painted in 1893 by Edvard Munch, so potently illustrates the spiritual atrophy and emptiness of heart spoken of Benedict XVI and evident in our society today. Benedict XVI went on to say, secularization profoundly distorts the Christian faith from within, and consequently the lifestyle and daily behaviour of believers. They live in the world and are often marked, if not conditioned, by the cultural imagery that impresses contradictory and impelling models regarding the practical denial of God. There is no longer the need for God to think of him or to return to him, Benedict said. Gaudium et Spes in 1965 called us to an authentic humanism when it said that the human person needs to be considered whole and entire, with body and soul, with heart and conscience, with mind and will. It spelt this out further when it said, in Christ, our human nature, by the very fact that it was assumed and not absorbed in Christ, has been raised in us also to a dignity beyond compare. For by his incarnation, Christ, the Son of God, has in a certain way united himself with each human person. Christ worked with human hands. Christ thought with a human mind. Christ acted with a human will. And with a human heart, Christ loved. Born of the Virgin Mary, Christ has truly been made one of us, and like us in all things but sin. It is in Christ that we find what it is to be truly, authentically human. One senses today a realization by many of a need to look beyond the self and to rediscover the divine. If the Church is to speak to this realization, it is imperative that it identify and recover its languishing but rich artistic and historical patrimony. A patrimony that eloquently records the search and encounter of humanity with the divine. The Church's artistic and historical cultural patrimony is a resource waiting to be rediscovered for the new evangelization. The challenge before us as a people responsible for the tradition and heritage of the Church, particularly in the context of this meeting, its liturgical tradition and heritage, is how do we not only rediscover, protect and preserve this heritage, but ensure that it continues for the purpose for which it was made. That is, to be a means of evangelization. This heritage is waiting, as I said, to be rediscovered and to be directed towards its end, that is, to evangelize and to call people to a realization of what it means to be authentically human. Thank you for listening, and I'll now pass on to Father Peter Williams.